That helps with the serve part of it. But the next thing that we're about to turn the corner on isn't just what geographic region your company is most effective in. It's the company sizes where you're most effective. And especially when it comes to something like outsourced data center maintenance, outsourced critical infrastructure maintenance, there's likely a company size of your ideal clients that becomes incredibly relevant. Like, how big does the company need to be to afford your company's services? Are you really able to be effective with a single location co-location operator with 4 employees? Do they really have the budget and the willingness and the ability to afford your services? Conversely, can you really effectively sell data center and critical infrastructure maintenance to a huge enterprise operator like NTT or Equinix or Digital Realty or something like that? Hello there, data center universe. It's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest questions across the data center go-to-market universe, including sales, marketing, customer success, and many companies known as account management, product, channel partnerships, and executive sponsors responsible for orchestrating, pulling together, uniting the whole GTM go-to-market team. And it doesn't matter what part of the data center ecosystem you work in, regardless of whether you're from an operator like a colocation, wholesale, hyperscale, edge, or modular kind of company, or maybe you're from a technology or facilities related company that sells to or partners with data centers, either data center operators or enterprise data centers, or perhaps you're from a construction company that builds data centers and designs data centers, or from a real estate or an investment related company that's responsible for things like REITs and raising capital, or perhaps you're from a sales and marketing related company that provides outsourced services to digital infrastructure and data center related companies. But regardless of your role on the go-to-market team, regardless of what your company does, you're for sure in the right place if you want to learn all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. That's what we're all about at DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. This week, what is on the agenda? We're going to talk about cable management companies getting to IT contacts in data centers. We'll look at how a data center and critical infrastructure maintenance company can grow its client pool. And then we'll turn our attention to how co-location data centers plan for revenue growth. After that, we'll take a quick message from our sponsor. Then when we come back, we'll look at how a data center construction and infrastructure company can improve its branding, how to generate data center decommissioning projects. Get that request quite often. And then we head down the home stretch and we'll look at how a green data center business can reach out to customers. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question. How can a cable management company get to IT contacts in data centers? It's a great question. And a lot of it depends on a couple of different variables. For starters, we need to know, does your company just sell cable management, or are there other related products and services that you provide to data centers? The reason that that's a question that needs to come up is that defines just how tight your ideal client profile, how tight your buyer personas are in the targeting of potential IT contacts, technology contacts in data centers. The second, so how comprehensive or how narrow your product line is, certainly plays a role in the kinds of job functions, the kind of titles, the kinds of different kinds of people that you need to be educating and building trust with within data centers. The second thing that plays a major role is the size of data centers that you're selling to, the size of enterprise data center companies or the size of data center operators that you're selling to. Generally, if you're selling to smaller data center operators, where a single person is going to have a lot of different roles and responsibilities, or wear a lot of different hats, as it's often referred to, you'll have a smaller pool of the kinds of people that you need to be building awareness and nurturing and building relationships with to ultimately hope to generate revenue from some of them. If you're selling to much larger data center operators and enterprise data centers, you'll likely encounter much more specialized roles. And because there's more specialized roles, sometimes you may have different kinds of people that you need to build relationships with. So at a company level, when it comes to growing your cable management business, you'll want to define an ideal client profile. The ideal client profile lays out a couple of important parameters for the kinds of companies that you want to ultimately sell to. It lays out geographically where they're located. Can your company sell globally, or does it just sell in one particular region of the world, or one particular country, or one particular part of a particular country? So first, you need to answer on your ideal client profile, what's your geographic coverage? Second, what size companies do you sell to, which are big enough to be a good fit for what you have to offer, but not so large that it would be a completely different kind of sales process, sales cycle, that involves much more operational complexity than your company may be able to navigate. So there's a geographic component, a company size component, and then in some cases, there may be an industry or business model component where certain kinds of who the data center sells to, what kind, if they're multi-tenant, what kinds of industries and business models are hosted within that facility, or if they're a single like hyperscale or wholesale or enterprise, what the nature of their business is. Sometimes that can impact what kinds of companies are a good fit or not a good fit. Not so much in cable management, but in other parts of the data center ecosystem, you start to get into regulatory issues that can dramatically impact how effective your company can be, depending on whether you're able to address the compliance needs of certain specific kinds of industries, like, for example, in healthcare or financial services or something like that. So you have your ideal client profile. Once you have your ideal client profile defined, which a lot of times can come from simply looking at the commonalities among your best clients, you'll want to define who are the kinds of people within those companies, who are the kinds of IT professionals within those companies that are most important to know that your company exists and to see your company as the go-to experts in your space. That's how you segment within the ideal client profile, and you end up with a couple of different buyer personas. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client that you want to do business with based on actual research and some select educated speculations. So you'll really need to, especially if you have limited resources, pick your battles and prioritize who your most important buyer persona is, your primary buyer persona, who your second most important buyer persona is, the secondary buyer persona. In some cases, you may have a tertiary buyer persona, the third most. How do you make these decisions? It's who's most profitable? What's the easiest sales cycle? Who's the best internal champion? What maps most closely to your current product roadmap and where your product roadmap is going to be 3, 6, 12 months down the road? All of those factor into how you prioritize your buyer personas. And in some cases, you may end up with a negative buyer persona. A negative buyer persona is a category of a person that you might encounter in one of these companies that just puts a whole monkey wrench in the process of being able to do business successfully. You've dealt with this kind of stakeholder over and over and over again. They're kind of toxic to your sales and customer experience process. And if you know that this person comes across your funnel or your lead generation, you want to try to exclude them out as rapidly as possible to avoid wasting resources of your sales teams. So when it comes to what a cable management company can do to get to the right IT contacts in data centers, having clarity at the company level is going to be incredibly important for building your target account list, doing basic account-based marketing. Having clarity on who the stakeholders are becomes incredibly important for how to segment and personalize your events and your messaging and your content experiences. And then once you have those buyer personas done, it's important to actually do the research and formulate, document what's most important, what's top of mind for each of these buyer personas. And you may want to spend more resources going deeper on the more important buyer personas, on the primary buyer persona and the secondary buyer persona. And for each of those, you'll likely end up with a multi-page document after you've looked at least 10 or 20 representative people in each of these segments. And on the document, you should understand the consensus on their goals. You should understand the consensus on their challenges, who they're influenced by, where they hang out online and offline. And that document, that framework becomes incredibly important for developing a content strategy, a go-to-market strategy, an event strategy that helps you get in as early as possible and as often as possible in the right context, so that you're seen as experts, subject matter experts, consultants, trusted advisors, teachers, and perhaps even rising all the way to the level of being seen as thought leaders. That's why it's so important to make sure that when you're researching and documenting these, that you don't exclusively depend on internal input, because you may be doing this a while, your boss may be in this business for a while, but the reality is it's super important that you get their words, in their own words, how they describe their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, their biggest stressors. If you make the assumption that you know their exact words because you've been doing this for a while, you could really sabotage your efforts, and the language just may not resonate at all. So what I typically recommend is, if there's internal input, make it about 20% of what goes into documenting and preparing your buyer personas. And then in the flip side of that, make sure 80% of the input for the personas is coming from external research. The ideal scenario is where you're doing actual interviews, customer, buyer kinds of interviews, face-to-face or on Zoom or something like that. If you're not able to do that, the next best thing could be perhaps running some surveys or examining a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. Look at basically how they describe themselves, look at the kinds of content they share, and do the same thing. Take those same names of the people that you're searching up on LinkedIn and looking for consensus around, and put them into a search engine, and see what comes up, and see if there's any interesting trade journals that they've been quoted in, any news releases they've been quoted in, any conferences that they've spoken at where you can watch a YouTube video. And then you roll that all together and try to find the consensus on what that buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges are. If you can't find the consensus, you may not have gotten the segmentation right. Because in order for this to be effective, you really need to be able to grab them by the virtual shirt collars as they're scrolling by on LinkedIn or wherever else you're going to intercept them, and make sure that they understand that you're speaking their language and can really help them close the gap on what they need to accomplish professionally, what their biggest individual goals, what their team goals are, what their company's goals are, and how you can help them address the biggest struggles and challenges that they're going through. What are the things that are causing them to potentially derail their career, causing them to miss time away from vacation, ruining their nights and weekends, and in general, just really being a huge pain in the you-know-what. So once you have consensus on that, it's much easier to have a content strategy, to have a content calendar, events calendar that really provides a ton of value throughout the full buyer's journey. And we need to get in early and often, because people just don't want to talk to sales teams anymore until they're at the absolute end of the buyer's journey. So we need to be in the awareness stage and in the consideration stage, and have a massive impact on shaping how they look at anything and everything related to cable management. When you can do that correctly, you will be essentially repositioning a lot of members of your sales team to get out of the transaction business and be seen more as trusted advisors and consultants and teachers. And that's incredibly important, because that makes your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with people from your team, as opposed to your team having to chase and beg and control and manipulate to try to get these meetings to happen. It's so much easier when your prospects and clients see your team as people that they actually want to spend time with, because they're like walking encyclopedias of anything and everything that's relevant to cable management, because you've seen the pattern recognition on what these kinds of companies and what these kinds of buyer personas need most throughout the full life cycle of that relationship. So you're able to share insights that not only address what their biggest questions are, but the questions that they ought to be asking that they haven't even thought of yet, because you know what's coming next. And when you do that right, not only does that make huge relationship trust building deposits into the account, but into the relationship equity account, it also can result in dramatic amounts of sales cycle acceleration. It gets rid of a lot of price sensitivity. If there's competitive bidding situations, it nearly guarantees that your company is on the short list. And in some situations, you may even completely neutralize all of the competitive forces on the short list. So by the time they get in market, by the time they get to the decision stage, your content, your events experience has been so elite, so world-class, so impactful on how that company and the decision committee navigates all of the available options that you basically won because of the tremendous amount of value that you've added to them and helping them understand anything and everything having to do with cable management. Next question up is, how does a data center and critical infrastructure maintenance company grow its client pool? Maybe called its client list, client roster, customer list, whatever you want to call it. So your company provides maintenance for data centers and critical infrastructure, and you want to grow your client base. So what do? We first need to look at where you've been most successful in providing data center and critical infrastructure maintenance in the past. So we're going to dig into things like reviews, testimonials, your case studies page on your website, and we're looking for commonalities because it's not purely, your company's not purely in the professional services business, but for sure, you've likely identified certain kinds of data centers and certain kinds of critical infrastructure companies where you've been successful in the past. And what we're looking to do is essentially clone that, copy, paste, lather, rinse, repeat. And in order to do that, we need to know what they have in common. What they have in common will likely intersect with some parts of your business that are inherent to what it is that you actually do. So this will help us define your client profile, your target account list, because we'll know like where your company can successfully provide data center maintenance and critical infrastructure maintenance geographically. Is it globally? Do you have hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of employees all over the planet and can provide these kinds of services in dozens of different geographic regions globally and dozens of different locales and dozens of different languages? Or are you a lot more localized? Are you ideally suited to serve clients in a certain metropolitan area, in a certain region of a country, in an entire country, in a group of countries, in a certain continent? Again, only you can answer that question because it's something unique to your business model and your service delivery capabilities for where you're actually able to provide data center and critical infrastructure maintenance. But that's super important to defining what you're going to do with your targeting. If you are selling globally, then some things like organic search or organic social could actually play a little better because you don't inherently need the targeting and the segmentation. If you sell in a much more narrow geographic market, then it becomes more difficult to make organic search and organic social work because it largely depends on the quantity and quality and the precision of your followers, of your connections, of your subscribers. The more narrow your market is, the more effective things like outbound account-based marketing, targeted LinkedIn ads are going to be extraordinarily effective. Things like search engine marketing, like paid search ads, Google ads, may not be as effective because although with Google ads, you can specify that you only want your ads to be seen in a geographic region, that helps with a certain part of it. But the next thing that we're about to turn the corner on isn't just what geographic region your company is most effective in. It's the company sizes where you're most effective. And especially when it comes to something like outsourced data center maintenance, outsourced critical infrastructure maintenance, there's likely a company size of your ideal clients that becomes incredibly relevant. Like, how big does the company need to be to afford your company's services? Are you really able to be effective with a single location colocation operator with 4 employees? Do they really have the budget and the willingness and the ability to afford your services? Conversely, can you really effectively sell data center and critical infrastructure maintenance to a huge enterprise operator like NTT or Equinix or Digital Realty or something like that? More than likely, it's a Goldilocks scenario of not too big, not too small. You'll ultimately need to define the bands, the range of company size, employee size. And the challenging part with all this is in the data center industry, people first and foremost are thinking of like square footage and megawatts of power and density. The reality, though, is when it comes to sales and marketing and using tools like LinkedIn, they all run based on a certain amount of employees. So at some point, you'll need to figure out like what the rough equivalencies are for who you're actually targeting. I suspect working with similar kinds of businesses like this in the past, that 1,000 plus employees may be to the point where it practically falls off the cliff, where it's nearly certain that the companies are doing these kinds of functions in-house. Below 10 employees, they very likely don't have the budget to afford you. So you're left with potentially a band of like 10 to 1,000 employees, but you'll probably tighten that up over time as well. So once you know that, then you're able to build out a target account list of companies, a couple dozen, couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand companies at the most, that look like a fantastic fit for who you'd want to be doing business with. From there, you can look at the individual kinds of people that you need to be building relationships with to educate and build trust with over time. Those would be your buyer personas, and you rank them by primary, secondary, tertiary buyer personas. And then once we know who the most important kind of stakeholder is that we need to build the relationship to grow our account pool, then we go and we do the research. We talk to potentially 10 or 20 of those folks, or at least look at how they describe themselves and the kind of content they share and the kind of events they interact with. And we get the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest struggles when it comes to maintaining their data center and critical infrastructure. Once we have consensus on that, then we're going to go about building a content and events calendar where we can show up, our entire go-to-market team can show up as early as possible and as often as possible to educate and build trust with those potential clients. Because in a world where 83% of a typical buyer's journey is now over before sales contact, if we don't get in early, we're going to be practically invisible. In other words, we're just a non-factor. We're not going to be considered at all. And if they do manage to find us at the absolute tail end, the only thing that could possibly, and this is a very remote possibility of winning them over, is by severely undercutting the competition. But that's a race to the bottom. You're going to destroy the profitability of your company. You're going to demoralize your employees. It's much more practical to realize that, okay, there's quite a bit of subject matter expertise in your company. Now we need to take the really smart, really experienced people in your company, and we need to get them in as early as possible and as often as possible, so your target accounts, so the most important buyer personas at your target accounts, recognize your team as the go-to experts in your space. And the way we do that is we recognize that we can't just wait till our prospects and clients are quote unquote in market, because only 5 or 10% of people are in market at any given time. And the journey at that point is at least 83% over. We need to get in the awareness and the consideration stages of the buyer's journey. We need to have an active role in as many of the 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision. And the way we do that is we show up as teachers, as trusted advisors, as subject matter experts, as consultants, and possibly even thought leaders. We need to be the ones teaching our prospects and clients anything and everything that can help them do their job better when it comes to all aspects of data center maintenance and critical infrastructure maintenance. So it's a repositioning exercise. Your sales people can no longer show up as transaction-focused salespeople who are just focused on getting opportunities onto the deals board and cramming them down prospects as quickly as possible and being as aggressive as possible and forcing meetings on them. The reality is your prospects and clients need to want to spend time with members of your team, because they see them as dramatically impacting their understanding of all the issues that are important to maintenance of their data center or their critical infrastructure, because you've seen the patterns on what works for these kinds of companies and what doesn't work, and what works for these kinds of buyer personas and what doesn't. And you're taking the time to invest and do this the right way so that your sales professionals now show up looking more like Big Four consultants rather than just car salespeople. They need to look more like the doctor-patient consultative kinds of relationships. The kind of vibe that your prospects and clients get from your sales team should feel a lot more like they're talking to an elite consultant from like PwC or KPMG or EY or Deloitte or something like that. When you can take that up next level, it is a game changer for your ability to impact how those prospects and clients navigate the full buyer's journey. The criteria that they're going to use to judge all the other options that they evaluate. And you'll know this is working because by the time your salesperson, your account executive goes in for that first meeting, they are literally quoting your content back to you that they've used as the framework and the methodology for their entire team. Everyone always says, like, how do I get the decision maker? What's super important is that your content is so helpful that the one stakeholder that originally finds you is very responsive when they get that email back from you that says, who else should be reading this? Who else should attend this? Who else should be watching this? We all know that data center maintenance takes a village. It typically involves people across operations, facilities management, finance, whatever. You give the 5, 6, 7 different roles within a data center operator, enterprise, or critical infrastructure that are typically interested in maintenance. And you prompt them and you're like, oh yeah, actually, no, I should pass this. Because when they're forwarding around your content resource or your event invitation or your webinar recording or what have you, they're not sticking their neck out on the line by formally recommending that their employer do business with your company. All they're saying is, hey, I found this great resource, check it out. And when that happens, that's how you start to win over the committee. That's how you start to understand how you map the committee, of understanding who actually is on the decision committee, because you start to look down at your CRM like HubSpot or something like that. And you're like, oh, this is really interesting. In the last hour, 6 people from the same company have registered for our webinar. They must be talking about us. That is awesome. And oh yeah, everyone that registered wrote in their biggest data center maintenance challenge that they're going through. So now I have this incredible level of intelligence on how each person perceives their biggest problem. Understanding what it takes to educate and build trust is the major, major unlock to growing this kind of business in the future. The challenge is there's still a lot of people controlling the budgets and the purse strings that are still doing the business the same way they did 10 years ago, when the world has dramatically changed. 10 years ago, about half of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact. Now more than 80% of a typical buyer's journey is over before sales contact. Remember the first couple of years of the 2020s when most people were staying home and working from home? That dramatically accelerated things. As baby boomers retire and the decision makers are flowing more down to Gen X and millennials, and in some cases even Gen Z, you can be sure that there's a lot more self-propelled, self-driven research that's going on. So the question is, what is your company going to do to make sure that you get in as early as possible, as often as possible, and are seen as the go-to experts in your space when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center maintenance and critical infrastructure maintenance? The ball's in your court. Next question up is, how does a colocation data center plan for revenue growth? How does a colocation data center plan for revenue growth? That's a fantastic question. And I think it's one in which a lot of executives at colos are doing a lot of soul searching right now. Because going forward, there's going to be colocation data centers that are able to host clients that are running AI and high performance compute. And there's going to be colocation data centers that are not able to support those kind of power requirements and density requirements. So that's the first cut. The second cut, and this is something that I've seen probably for about at least 10 years already, is there's the single location colocation business, the multi-location colocation business, 2, 3, 4, maybe a handful of locations. And then there's the colocation business that scales nationally or potentially even globally. And each of those companies is able to attract a different kind of client. Because if you ever heard the expression decades ago that no one ever got fired for buying IBM, there's a very real kind of client that only wants to buy from the biggest of the big, that needs to buy from an Equinix or an NTT or a Digital Realty or a Switch or something like that. However, there's also a certain kind of client that doesn't want to do business with the big guys and instead wants to deal with a colocation operator where they have a personal relationship with the owner, a single or small multi-location kind of colocation operator. And then there's a lot of opportunity in the middle. So this would be like the tier points, the Flexentials, the QTSs, the data banks, the Vantages, and some of them are more wholesale and a little more hyperscale and less colocation. You get the idea here is that there's small, medium, and large when it comes to data center operators, regardless of whether you're focused on retail colocation or more wholesale or more hyperscale. And what it largely comes down to is you need to be very self-aware of where you can win, where your happiest, most profitable clients are coming from, what what makes their business tick. Like, especially with a data center operator, for sure, there's going to be business model and industry considerations, because the clients are going to make certain kinds of demands for compliance that you either have or you don't have. Along the same line, there's going to be clients that make demands for multi-location. So obviously, if you're a single location co-location company, those clients are also going to be off the target account list, are not going to be within your ideal client profile. So there's business model and industry considerations. There's how many locations you have. There's where you can actually successfully do business. For most co-location companies, there's your local clients. And then there's your clients that are outside the geographic area, but want to have a presence, need to have a presence for latency reasons, or perhaps for regulatory reasons in your local market. So you can be a single location co-location operator in New England within the United States, or within the Pacific Northwest within the United States, or within Finland, or within South Africa, or within Malaysia, and you have your local market. Those are the people that you could potentially have into your facility on a regular basis for tours and educational events like breakfast seminars and lunch and learns and networking events. And that's a certain kind of playbook. And then there's a completely different kind of playbook with a client that's decided that they need to have a co-location presence in Salt Lake City or Helsinki or Manila or Pretoria or something like that. So there's two really completely different kinds of playbooks that your marketing, your sales would potentially execute on. And in a big enough scenario, I would actually recommend that you specialize your marketing hire, your marketing team, depending on whether they're marketing local or marketing outside of your geographic area, because it's completely different muscles. The person that's selling globally for your single location or multi-location data center and isn't going to see its prospects and clients face to face, that you need product marketing and the ability to conduct Zoom meetings and virtual tours and things like that. That's at an elite world-class level. Whereas someone that's selling locally more face to face can get away a little bit with being more rough around the edges in certain of those kinds of categories. So when it comes to your revenue growth, yeah, there's a bunch of different considerations. And obviously there's geographic considerations, whether they're local to you or outside your geographic market. There's size considerations, where you can win, what companies are big enough to have the budget, willingness, and ability to afford your co-location, but not so large that they're likely to demand a different kind of company than you can certainly fill the shoes for. And then there's a whole bunch of business model considerations for you as well. Like, if you're determined to stay single location, you may need to have multiple sources, multiple revenue streams beyond co-location to make it worthwhile. Some co-location operators have morphed into marketing agencies. Some get into being managed service providers, or at least providing a lot of managed services, even if they're not calling themselves MSPs. Some are heavily involved in telecommunications, way just beyond normal meet me rooms and interconnect kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different ways to play this, but a lot of what dictates what you're going to do with revenue growth depends on the nature of your business model, depends on the nature of your capabilities, your capital that you have available. But at the end of the day, that's going to help you back into your ideal client profile and a target account list. That's going to help you back into who your buyer personas are, defining and researching your buyer personas. It's going to help you create an effective content and event strategy so that you're able to have a super important role in the first 83% of the buyer's journey when no one wants to talk to a salesperson anymore. That's a new thing, by the way. It used to be 10 years ago, maybe 60% of a buyer's journey was over. Now, well over 80% of a buyer's journey is over before sales contact. So these things that you may have regarded as nice to haves in the past, like content and events, are now you're completely invisible if you don't have those kinds of resource investments, or you're just left selling to the 5 to 10% of your market that still buys the same way they did in the 1990s. In other words, people that are in the 10th, 11th, 12th inning of their career. But that for sure doesn't represent the sweet spot of your market. So we need to be very self-aware of what your most important buyer personas, biggest goals and challenges are that they're struggling with, and make sure that we show up early and often as the teachers and subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and consultants. Otherwise, we're going to be just driven into commodity status. And in a lot of ways, I see the unsophisticated colocation provider getting boxed into the same kind of commodity problem that the web host did 10 years ago and that managed service providers had to confront with 10 years ago. So this is your moment where you need to figure out, like, what is your company going to do to stay relevant over the next 5 or 10 years? If you keep doing the same thing you've been doing and you're going to provide this kind of obsolete legacy colocation and you're going to keep trying to market as if it's still 10 years ago, it's not going to work out well. So this is the time to really think about what you're going to do with growth. What does your company's product and service roadmap look like now? What are your capabilities going to look like 3, 6, 12 months down the road? What are the kinds of companies that need this kind of co-location, both locally and potentially nationally and globally? How do you build a target account list of who needs to find out that your company exists so you can educate and build trust with the right stakeholders, the right buyer personas in these companies? And how do you make sure that you stay with them throughout their full journey, throughout the full typical 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, from awareness to consideration and consideration to decision? Is 90% of the unsophisticated co-location operators that come to me for consulting are only showing up in the decision stage when the game is already 83% of the way done. It's kind of like, imagine you're the general manager of a professional sports team and you're just not competitive in the first 3 quarters, the first 80% of the game. So it's like, it's a runaway. Like you don't have players that are going to be effective in the first 3 quarters of the baseball game, in the first 3 quarters of the basketball game, the soccer game, the football game, or in a baseball game, you don't have players that are going to be effective until the 8th inning or something like that. So you're getting completely crushed on the field with other competitive options that are out there because someone else is stepping in to fill the void to help your ideal clients understand how to address their biggest goals, how to address their biggest challenges, get answers to their biggest questions, and staying with them in a way that they can dramatically impact how they evaluate and compare all the other options that are in front of them. So those are the most important considerations if you're trying to educate and build trust and grow your revenue for your colocation business. And of course, too, we focus so far primarily on net new revenue generation. For a lot of colocation providers, there's a big revenue growth opportunity with your existing clients as long as they're reasonably happy and you build a good relationship with them. I actually did a podcast interview a few weeks back with the president of a data center operator in the Southwest United States, I think about 150, 200 employees. And we talked about how sales and marketing has changed in recent years. And his answer on a lot of this stuff is that so many buyers are now signing up self-service. So the real sales process happens following sign up when you have a new client that's signing up and you're getting to know what their true needs are. You're able to have like a CTO level discussion because your sales team has gotten that upskilled, up level, and be able to have these quality conversations. And you're exploring what their other true needs are. So onboarding, initial intended value, and ultimately extended value, cross-selling, upselling, customer marketing, all become incredibly important.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
How can data center construction and infrastructure companies improve their branding? How can a data center construction and infrastructure company improve its branding? That's a great question. And I think it's an especially timely time. It's for sure the right time to be addressing this. Why? Because I still come across a lot of people that believe that their branding is purely aesthetics. They're thinking about their brand guide. They're thinking about their tone of voice, the hexadecimal colors that you'll see in their logos and on their website and in their print and electronic collateral and their fonts and their logos. The reality, though, is in a self-propelled buyer's journey where 83% of the buyer journey is over before vendor contact, your brand is no longer limited to just the factors that would normally be the domain of a creative director. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. And given that you're no longer in the room for most of the buyer's journey, the first 83% of that buyer's journey, that is an enormous, enormous amount of gap that we need to fill between dealing with branding as if it's 10 years ago and dealing with branding today. So what can we do to dramatically influence how the marketplace talks about us when we're not in the room? Because your salespeople are really not going to be welcome in the room for much of the buyer's journey anymore. They're really getting squeezed out. So how do we get them back into these great conversations? Well, a lot of that comes down to repositioning, remodeling your sales approach, your sales playbook, your marketing playbook for how modern buyers now navigate and compare options and evaluate pricing and make these purchase decisions. And the way we do that is your salespeople, your marketing people can no longer show up as transaction focused. They need to show up as true subject matter experts. Increasingly more, I'm talking to sales leaders who have made such large investments in their technical skills that many of them could actually have a side hustle nights and weekends being a fractional CTO to small and medium-sized businesses. It's that next level. So if you have gotten to that level with you and your team, give yourself a nice pat in the back. You're on the right track. If you're still thinking the rules don't apply to you, I would challenge you to think about how many times a day you pick up this device yourself. Is it the first thing in the morning? First thing you look at in the morning when you get up? Is it the last thing you look at in the evening before you go to bed? Do you look at it anywhere from dozens to hundreds of times throughout the day? This is the remote control of our lives. And there's an excellent chance that your buyer personas, your most important stakeholders at the kind of companies that you want to do business, are spending their days the exact same way. Are you really going to tell me that the internal champion for a data center construction project, an infrastructure kind of project, is communicating with their vendors and partners using a fax machine or a dial-up modem or one of those paper envelopes that used to have the little red string that you tied around and you passed around from person to person and they initialed that you saw it? Are they getting their phone messages using those little pink while you were out messages? Now I'm really dating myself for things that happened in the earlier stages that I saw in offices happening in the early stages of their career. But like, if your buyers would laugh you out of the building if you asked them for their fax number, don't make your investments as if you think that that's actually how they're still doing business. The reality is even the most digitally resistant internal champions for things like data center construction and data center infrastructure, I can assure you, are spending a ton of time on their phones, asking their peers for expert opinions, watching videos, listening to podcasts, attending webinars. And if you don't realize this yourself, then it's time to go back to the drawing board and do your buyer persona research. Don't make these assumptions based on things that you think might be true, but may be off the reservation, completely wrong from the actual factual reality that's out there. That's why when it comes to identifying, after you've identified your ideal client profile and you're figuring out who are the buyer personas that you need to build relationships within these companies that need construction infrastructure, when you're segmenting out your buyer personas, you actually need real research to document their goals and their challenges. It's fine to talk to some internal stakeholders on your team and use that for a little bit of the research, maybe 20, 25%, but 80% of that research needs to come from actually talking to real prospects and real clients face to face or over video meetings or phone calls. Or if you don't have access to that, at the absolute minimum, study how they describe themselves on their LinkedIn profiles in their own words, study the kinds of content that they're sharing, study the kinds of events and topics that they're interacting with and that they're super interested about. That's going to give you the consensus in their own words about what they care about. And then we need to recognize that the overwhelming preponderance of buyers don't want to talk to sales until the absolute end of their journey. So in order for us to show up and have a role and be a factor in these early and middle stages of the buyer's journey, in order to influence the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are available for them for big construction infrastructure projects, we need to show up as a teacher, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, thought leader. And the way we do that is through content, through great videos, podcasts, webinars, live streams, and even offline versions of that, where you're hosting your own events. If you're fortunate enough to be doing business in a geographic region where most of your prospects and clients live and work, and they can get to your facility with a half hour to an hour drive, you should absolutely positively be hosting educational events with your most important buyer personas on a pretty regular basis. You could start with a quarterly lunch and learn series. You could start with quarterly breakfast seminars. If you have a medium to large size conference room in your building, or you have a training classroom, or you have access to be able to rent or barter or borrow a trusted partners kind of room relatively inexpensively, and you're not doing this kind of stuff, oh my gosh, are you missing out on an enormous opportunity to build really deep relationships with your most important prospects and clients? Because to go do major national and global events, you need to make investments that are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. To host these own events in your own training classroom or in your conference room, or a client or partner that's bartering with you or letting you use their space or something like that in return for a little bit of billing, you realize that nearly all of the expense and effort is really just getting the right people to attend. Bringing in catering for lunch or bringing in catering for breakfast, infinitesimally small relative to doing field events. The more important issue is getting the right people there. But if you're already doing the right things with defining your ideal client profile, your target account list, you're doing lead generation on a regular basis, this is the top and the middle of your funnel. This is also how you get the word of mouth going, because person one from a target account registers for this event. They get back an email that says, who else should be at this? We know that major data center construction and infrastructure projects take a village. Typically people from this role, this job function, that job title, what have you, 4, 5, 6 different people are involved. So given that, who else from your team should also join us for our breakfast seminar next month? Just hit the forward button, tell your colleagues why, and you'd be shocked how that basic email marketing automation thing that's been around for 20 years, how crazy effective that is in getting multiple stakeholders from the same company attending your in-person events or your virtual events or your roadshow or whatever, however you are doing this. So when it comes time to how you're going to improve your branding, the more you can get the right people in the right places at the right time to interact with you in the right context so that they see you and your team as the go-to experts in your space when it comes to construction infrastructure, that's your branding. That's your lead generation. That's your lead nurturing. That's your sales cycle acceleration. That's what gets deals on the deals board. That's what gets stuck deals unstuck, because you're most importantly educating and building trust. Educating and building trust. And you have a choice. You can be the one that's doing this, or other companies, other organizations, other media and events companies are going to fill that void. But make no mistake, they're learning from someone or someones. The more they're learning from you, the more they're spending time with people from your team, the more you're able to influence the criteria by which they evaluate and judge all of the competitive options that are in front of them. So when you do this right, you're nearly guaranteed to be on the short list. When you do this at an elite world-class level, you literally can knock competitors out of contention because you've built such a deep relationship with your most important prospects and clients by using events and education as a true differentiator throughout the full buyer's journey. So when it comes to how a data center construction and infrastructure company can improve its branding while simultaneously impacting revenue growth, remember, the branding is about a lot more than aesthetics today. If the only person working on your branding is someone that's like a creative director, you're missing out on what branding truly is today. Branding is now anything and everything that the market says about your company when you're not in the room. And given that by default, you're not going to be in the room more than 80% of the time, we need to flip that on its head and get you back in the room. And the best way to get you back in the room is to show up early and often as teachers, trusted advisors, subject matter experts, thought leaders. That's the key unlock with all of this when it comes to improving your branding for data center construction and infrastructure. Next question. How do we generate data center decommissioning projects? How do we generate data center decommissioning projects? Yeah, I've actually worked on this one with a couple of clients already. So the interesting part with AI and high performance compute is it's making a lot of legacy data centers obsolete. In the same way that if you've worked in your career in IT, you know that back in the heyday of Windows desktop and server, literally were operating systems that were forcing a hardware refresh cycle, right? So in a lot of the same ways, AI and HPC, high performance compute, is actually forcing a data center facility refresh cycle because a lot of the legacy facilities just don't have the power. They don't have the density to be able to support the kind of requirements going forward. So to generate data center decommissioning projects, we need to recognize that there's going to be a lot of legacy data centers that are decommissioned purely for that reason. And there's going to be a hand-me-down effect going on to a certain degree. On our podcast, I interviewed someone who was a former operations executive for one of the big three hyperscalers. And we're talking through like what happens to these facilities after 2-3 years. And almost certainly that's when the real estate people, the DCRE, the data center real estate folks, get involved, because one person's cast-offs are another operator's treasures. So this is where a former facility from one of the big three hyperscalers gets acquired by one of the outsourced hyperscalers or one of the big national or global colocation facilities. And there, as it trades down from the big national or global colocation providers, when they pull the plug, when they decommission something 5 years later, some of their facilities get passed down to the next level, the small regional or the local providers. And in some cases, when there's no utility left on any of that stuff, it gets taken out of commission as a data center completely, and it gets converted to, used to be office space, but with now so many people working from home and remote teams, it's going to different uses, maybe industrial space, maybe it's getting repurposed residential, maybe it's community space, maybe it's getting leveled to the ground. And most of the value from that real estate has to do with the power and telecommunications lines that are coming in, and it needs to be thought of from that sense, or maybe it becomes an edge facility. Either way, there's a ton of decommissioning projects that are going on now because AI is forcing a lot of these decision points around. So the best way to know about this is to be perpetually building a brand and being known in the space as a company that does great work on decommissioning projects. So we need to understand what geographic regions you can truly cover with your team. And then we need to understand what company sizes you're best in working on complex decommissioning projects for. Like, for example, does your team really have the capability to work with all size data center operators? Are you equally as effective decommissioning 3 data centers from a small regional company or decommissioning some massive facilities from large hyperscalers or global data center operators? And again, you can answer that question based on your talent and process and expertise and capital that you're able to deploy with all this. But yeah, you need to understand like the regions you can operate and the company sizes you can operate. Once you've done that, it'll enable you to build a finite list of target accounts that you want to grow these relationships with over time. Probably anywhere from a couple dozen to maybe most likely a couple hundred, in some cases a couple thousand kinds of companies that you think are going to have decommissioning projects coming up in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, whatever it is. And then we need to understand who the stakeholders are in those companies that we want to build relationships with. When it comes to decommissioning, it depends entirely on the size of the data center that's being decommissioned. What are the most appropriate roles to build these relationships with? And large enough facilities, there's going to be decommissioning, whole decommissioning teams that you work with, their counterparts to your team. In smaller companies, this could be as a couple dozen employees. You may be dealing directly with an owner or a CEO or CTO or something like that, and everything in between. But how many different hats, how many different roles they have will depend immensely depending on the size of the data center that you're doing this decommissioning work. But yeah, once you have an idea of the most likely couple hundred companies that you want to build relationships with, how can you create content that allows and experiences and events that allows you to stay with them throughout their full life cycle, throughout their full journey? So I would look to do things like hosting a weekly podcast where each week you interview a different decommissioning expert, either from other companies, other outsourced companies in your space, or internal resources that are experts on decommissioning. I'd host live streams and webinars on these topics on a regular basis. And of course, the topics that you talk about on all of these should be a function of what you discover when you do your buyer persona research, the biggest goals and challenges, because you want to make sure that you're not just seen as a decommissioning vendor. You want to make sure that your company and your team are seen as the definitive go-to experts on anything and everything having to do with data center commissioning. And in today's world, where so much of the journey is over before sales contact, we need to make sure that we're able to get in early and often in the self-propelled journey. And the way to do this is content and events experiences, elite experiences that really enable you to do a ton of great education and trust building with the most important stakeholders in these companies, so you stay with them throughout their full journey, throughout as many of the 28 touch points as possible. So you're nearly guaranteed to be on the short list as they get a little further down and they start to knock out and qualify versus disqualify certain companies that they want to work with. And these are massive, massive projects. I've talked to people where they're literally taking millions or tens, 8 figures in equipment out of the facility and getting a chance to be able to recycle. And they do partnerships and deals on rev shares and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's about really understanding your target addressable market. It's understanding the defined companies, the target account list of companies that have these decommissioning projects. It's about understanding the stakeholders and building relationships so you stay with them throughout the full journey. If you're just using outbound and trying to force these meetings all the time, you may not be selling how they actually want to buy. I guess in theory, if you're selling to people that are 40, 50 years into their career and they're still doing business the same way they did in the 1990s, knock yourself out. But if you're selling to a more balanced decision committee, a more balanced company where you're dealing with a mix of a little bit of baby boomers, a lot of Gen X, a lot of millennials, some Gen Z, you need to understand just how much the journey's changed over the past 10 years, where nearly all of it is over before vendor contact. And the only way that we're going to get you in there early and often is to show up as the teachers, to show up as the consultants, to show up as the experts. You can do that, or one of your competitors is going to do it, or there's going to be a media or events company or channel company or something like that that's going to show up and fill that void. But understand, they're learning from someone. If they learn from you, this can be a dramatic accelerator in the quality and the quantity of your relationships for these decommissioning projects. If you're trying to act as if your decommissioning clients don't know about these things and they're still doing faxes and they're still doing postal mail, they're still getting all their information from print trade publications. In other words, you think that they're still living in the early 2000s or the 1990s. I don't know what to tell you except get more self-aware about who they are, what they care about, and what their preferences are when it comes to anything and everything having to do with their decommissioning needs. Okay, that brings us to the final question that we're going to address in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream. By the way, if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming events and resources just like this, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox every Sunday. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. You'll see a button right at the top of the homepage to subscribe, or alternatively, you can go right to the sign up page at dcsmi.com/newsletter. So the final question that we'll be looking at for this week is, how does a green data center business reach out to customers? So you have a data center business that's green focused, environmental sustainability focused. How do you reach out to customers? So if I answer that literally, this is going to be outreach that involves your customer success and account management team and a customer marketing initiative, because you're saying you're reaching out to customers. If I take it a little less literally, you probably mean prospective clients, prospective customers. So let's take the first scenario. The first scenario where we want to reach out to existing customers. So assuming that our CRM system, our customer relationship management system, or email database is in relatively good shape, there's probably a minimum of 2 different kinds of motions that you have to build and nurture and expand relationships with your existing customers. You likely have people, and then you have some things that scale a little better than people. The people would be like your CSMs, your customer success managers, or your account managers, your AMs, depending on what you're calling it. These are the folks that work with your existing customers to make sure that they're getting great value from your data center related business. They make sure that they're happy with uptime. They make sure they're happy with their bills, that there's no surprises, that you know what's coming next. You've knocked it out of the park on onboarding. You've knocked it out of the park on getting to initial value, intended value, and extended value. And there's great relationships with there. And hopefully there's the unit economics are strong enough that you can actually support hiring great people and having your great people have a decent enough ratio relative to the number of clients they manage that they can build great relationships with your existing clients. In addition to that one-to-one kind of motion with your existing team, for existing customers, you likely want to invest in customer marketing. This is where you do one-to-many. This is where you have great tutorial videos, great email courses, great on-demand courses, and great events. These can be virtual events, like streams, private webinars just for existing clients, which for a big enough account, you may be hosting these events just for one particular a group of stakeholders at one particular account. For smaller accounts or on a more frequent basis, you're probably inviting all of your customers together, but they're customer-only events, they're customer-only webinars. You may do offline versions of those as well. In-person events, customer conferences, customer user groups can be hugely, hugely impactful for reaching out to your existing customers. So that's the existing customers. And what goes without saying is if you're green focused, most of your content, most of your events will likely revolve around sustainability, heat reuse, density, power use, carbon offset credits, decarbonization. Their own words, of course. Do the buyer personas, make sure you know their own words about what's top of mind for them, and then deliver a ton of value to your existing customers. So that's typically done by a combination of customer marketing and customer success. What about future customers? Future customers, that's going to be a go-to-market playbook that's run by traditional marketing, what's often called sales development reps, account executives. And again, it's a similar kind of focus on a certain kind of company, ideal client profile, your total addressable market, probably nothing new there, having a target account list, and the buyer personas who you want to build these relationships with as future potential clients that care about sustainability, that care about your green data center business. So what topics should you be creating content around? Your blogs, your videos, your podcasts, your webinars, your offline versions of those, your breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, and similar kinds of events. Let your buyer personas dictate the priorities. In other words, don't assume that you know what they care about. Do the actual research. Maybe 20% of the input for what goes into your buyer persona document comes from internal stakeholder interviews, but 80%, most of that input should come from external research, from ideally face-to-face conversations. Second best would be video conversations. If you can't get access to either of those, then at the absolute minimum, you should be looking at a stack of representative LinkedIn profiles and search footprint for those individual people about how they describe themselves, their words on what they care most about, what's stressing them out the most, where they spend time, what they spend time on, all the sources of influence. That'll give you the consensus on what your whole go-to-market playbook, your sales and marketing efforts should be focusing on for future clients for your green-related data center business. But the key thing is we need to remember that most of your customers, most of your future customers don't want any vendor contact, don't want any sales contact till they're nearly ready to purchase. Gartner found 83% of a typical journey is over before vendor contact. The only way we're going to get you in early and often enough is to completely change your mindset with this. So instead of being just focused on closing a transaction and getting a deal on the deals board, that we're focused on getting you in early and often as the teacher, the subject matter expert, the consultant, and the trusted advisor. So when it comes to how you're prospects, how your future customers think of green data centers, your company is in there as often as possible and as many of those 28 touch points throughout awareness and consideration decision. So the decks are really, really strongly stacked in your favor when it comes time to the purchase decision. So that's how a green data center business can reach out to both existing customers and future potential customers. And then the outreach is just simply a matter of outbound and ads and social reach and email and all the typical things that are hopefully in your go-to-market playbook. So that was the final question that we'll be looking at for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI. We're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's show, where I address some of the biggest questions that data center related go-to-market professionals have throughout the full journey, regardless of where you are in the ecosystem. We host these each week. We look forward to seeing you back again next week and hope you're having great success with growing your business. Let us know how we can help. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.